People love cheese and shredded cheese, so...
I mean, what are you trying to say?
I'm saying it used to be a mango.
Oh, I love mangoes. Same here, sir.
Frickin' delicious. Plus, this used to be a Japanese mango.
Very exotic.
That's the name of the mango.
Yes, sir, it is.
And people love cheese and shredded cheese, so...
I mean, what are you trying to say?
I'm saying it's...
The case manufacturers really showed up in force at CES this year. Some less competently than others, but still forceful. That means there's a lot to look forward to, for good and bad reasons, over the next 10 months or so. The biggest trend this year was mesh-fronted cases, something for which we've been the vanguard for years now. This is a big change from previous years and the glass and RGB obsession, and we're hopeful that things are moving in the right direction. In this video, we'll recap most of the upcoming case launches for this year, including the best and worst of what we saw at the show. Before that, this video is brought to you by us and the GN Store, where we now have our GPU diagram shirt listed with two of the most disappointing GPUs from 2019, but with an updated back design. We also just restocked our Teardown Teal shirts and have plenty of medium mod mats in stock and shipping now. If you were going to buy from us anyway, now is a good time. Until February 19th, we're giving 10% of all store revenue to Adelaide Koala and Wildlife Hospital and to Wildlife Rescue South Coast to assist with wildlife recovery in Australia. Or you can donate directly to them at the links in the description below. We visited nearly all of the case manufacturers at the show, and some of them we skipped for posting videos on. Asus was one of those, where it's not really a case manufacturer as much as it is just getting into doing cases as kind of one-offs at present, but they're trying. In this video, though, we're really focusing on walking through each of the major case announcements for 2020. We already have a full picture for most of what's coming out for the year. Definitely a few more will sneak in towards the end of the year. They always do, especially towards the November timeline. But remember that case development takes as long as 18 months, so sometimes longer than that, and most of 2020's launches have already been shown at this point. For the ones that haven't been revealed yet because they try to keep it secret until closer to launch, we'll see those around Computex, but there are more cases coming out in March than really the previous few years have had good cases in total, and the rest of the year is pretty packed too. Let's round up the worst and best for what we know about 2020's cases so far, and hopefully some of the manufacturers will have time to make tweaks before launch. In the very least, these should be on your radar for one reason or another. One of the worst cases we saw was the Asus Z11, tied with MSI, up next for a design approach that seems clueless to both space efficiency and thermals. The Z11 is named as such because the motherboard tray is at an 11-degree angle, which is kind of cool looking, to give Asus credit for that, and the case tries to orient the GPU toward the front window when standing vertically. Also, a cool design, not totally unique, but one that's going to become popular in the next year. It has the feet to sit horizontally if you wanted, but it's really intended for use as a tower. This has been done before. The iBuyPower Revolt 2 and manufacturers we met with at this show actually expressed an interest in a similar approach, so you see more GPU face plates at the front of cases in the future. Unfortunately for Asus, the idea is the only good thing about this case. The execution was not that. It was not good. I expressed frustration at the show with most design elements, and it was clear that depending with whom we spoke, the criticisms weren't always understood. I'll give credit here to our main Asus PR contact for really bridging the gap between us and technical marketing and the PMs, because he really seemed to see what we were saying. I'm hopeful that maybe there's some more dialogue there internally where PR can help express what we were saying in a way that the PMs and technical teams can execute on some improvements. But either way, we hope that Asus will improve the product prior to launch, maybe with this video as a bit of a guide. There are probably some B-roll clips you'll see showing me in the background talking to them. And if I recall correctly, I think there's times where I was just like pulling out my hair and looking really frustrated. And that's because of this product. So none of the motherboard makers have really seemed to figure out how to make a good case yet. Gigabyte, flat out failed. Worst cases we've seen in a long time. They were like Zalman 2007 style cases. And Asus and MSI have the best chance to do it properly. They seem to be taking some of the feedback and they seem to be improving with each show, but they're still making these massive missteps that just illustrate how, you know what, having all this money and being a good motherboard manufacturer doesn't just translate to being a good case manufacturer. We complain about thermals a lot, and it's not always about airflow with cases, but there's a difference between a design choice and sabotaging yourself, which is what Asus is sort of doing here. The first problem is the most obvious with the case. The bottom of the case sits almost flat with the table in its vertical orientation, how it's intended to be used. The feet on the bottom are maybe about 0.5 to 1 millimeter tall. Asus actually has ventilated holes in the bottom. You have to lift the case up and stick your hand under there to find them because otherwise it's not lifted high enough to tell, but they're there. The company told us that these holes are meant for GPU exhaust and cards with horizontal fins or intake otherwise, which sort of makes sense. In reality though, it won't be used at all because good luck getting air through 2 to 3 90-degree turns, then through about 70% plastic with minimal holes, and then a dust filter in the holes that are present, and then into the component. The case needs more spacing from the table, which can fortunately be fixed without even retooling it if Asus wanted to do it. And if that doesn't change before launch, then we know how much Asus cares. The PM expressed concern about tipping over, but we don't think a 1-inch tall foot is going to cause that. The center of mass is still on the bottom with the power supply, and a quarter of the video card, and a quarter of the radiator, which has water in it. It's probably going to be fine. And if that's not enough to prevent tipping over, then the difference, the delta between 1 inch and 1 millimeter, sorry for switching units on you, isn't really going to make a difference anyway. The next issue is that the GPU is smashed against the glass, and the display GPU chosen is about a 3-slot design already. Asus would point out that a tiny ventilation port with a thick plastic grill on it, more plastic than hole, again, is where the air can be taken in for the GPU. That small strip, it's about this big, going down part of the front of the case, is where the cooling comes in for the video card. They'd also point out the ventilation holes on the side of the case for exhaust, assuming air isn't pulled in from it pursuant to whatever pressure pattern ends up being created by the case and its fan layout. Unfortunately, the front grille offers a couple % coverage. We didn't sit there and calculate it, but it's probably 2 to 5% coverage of the GPU fans. It's a small strip off to the side, useful for a small sliver of the fans to breathe through. The case has a lot of interesting but expensive small things like these plastic filters that socket in everywhere. It's not cheap to do all that extra tooling in the metal to fit all those things. It takes more machine time, which costs more money. And then all the extra plastic appendages, all the filters where if Asus simplified its design, it could really slim down on this stuff, cut costs, and either sell the case for the same amount because they're Asus and they think they can and have a higher margin, or sell it for a cheaper price and be more competitive with the wider case market. As for the radiator, that's another one of the problems. The back of the case does offer support for a 240 CLC, which is nice for an ITX case. More on that in a moment though. Except when we asked, where does the air go? The answer was, what do you mean? The rear aluminum panel covers at least half of the top fan. Remember that even though holes are present, the metal is still a significant portion of that venting area, and it covers a good amount of the bottom fan as well. As for the space efficiency, this case doesn't come close to what seasoned manufacturers like Silverstone might offer in this form factor. This case is nearly big enough for an ATX motherboard, but the interior has so much blank space that you mostly end up with dead zones. We could get over this if the rest of the design were good, but it's tone deaf to the way the case market has been evolving, and we'll prove that with the rest of the entries in today's video. As for the upsides, it's got an LCD screen, it's got a unique motherboard orientation, so that's kind of cool, and it's mostly made of aluminum, so it'll be easy to melt it down when it's stuck on the warehouse shelves. Moving on to the next best worst case, the MSI Creator Series. We already knocked MSI a lot on the show floor. At the point in the show when we got to MSI, we'd already become frustrated with poorly designed products or products that weren't even honest in their representation. For example, a few of the things we saw at the show, we were told this is a Ryzen 4000 laptop. MSI, by the way, was one of these companies. And then when we checked system information, it had a previous gen part in it. So at that point, it's just lying and hoping no one will ever notice. But we're talking about cases though, so let's stay on that. This is the turning point though, where we started to get more aggressive with our show floor coverage. MSI Sakura 500P isn't the worst case, but it's really not impressive. That's not the one that bothers us the most though. The Creator 400M is the problem case. It's a mix of steel and thick plastic that shows a similar lack of awareness to the rest of the case industry. Even ignoring the thermal side of things, the case just tries to mix and match a lot of weird trends from different years and cases. It's got a front door, for example, that has a thin canvas sheet on it. This will end up creating more noise than it stifles because you'll have to run the fans harder to get past the door. It's like taking the best things about Be Quiet cases and then executing them with about 25% of the effort or engineering. The plastic grille in the front didn't even have a dust filter on it. No filter behind it to catch the dust, so it will do nothing. The power supply shroud had fan mounts that were at least 10 to 15% obstructed by solid steel on either side, with nowhere for those fans to pull air. The bottom of the case is too far, and it's obstructed by a power supply, a stack of hard drives, and cables, so no air is getting through that. Let's get back to cases that don't suck though. We already covered this one in a video. We'll start with some of the more unique cases of the show. Thermaltake's DistroCase 350p was first run at Computex 2019, but it was in an extremely early prototype phase. The case is now feature complete and should ship in early 2020. We've got to give it to Thermaltake for turning its best case, the P3 and P5 wall-mountable test benches, into basically a giant reservoir. Singularity Computers really advanced the idea of a distribution plate being integral to the case's structure, but Thermaltake made its core P1, P3, and P5 cases before Singularity Computers made its own chassis with a similar frame. Both companies are doing similar things to each other here, so we'll let them share the credit. Thermaltake has had a troubled few years with very few properly good cases, but alongside the View71, the P1, P3, and P5 were some of its best and most unique designs. The DistroCase 350p has modified the original chassis to include a fan bracket for the front of the enclosure, making it possible to mount a radiator with fans up front, and it also has a motherboard tray that swivels out from the distribution plate so that when opened, the tray is used for all of the cable management and for hiding accessories. The backside of the case is one big reservoir and accidentally integrates the TT logo into the flow pattern. This creates the water vortex effect on the logo, combined with Thermaltake's new coolant that you see used here. The backside also has a port for an easy drain, while the front side offers easy connection for multiple components to the distro plate, cleaning up the flow path and the build. The distro case should be available in late Q1 or early Q2 for this year, with pricing still undetermined. The last number we heard was about $600 MSRP. Thermaltake also had its AHT-600 case, or attack helicopter, but that case is less interesting to us overall. One of our commenters actually on that video noted that as a former helicopter mechanic for the military, they really liked the look of the case. That's the right kind of buyer for the AHT-600. For people who care less about if it properly resembles a helicopter and who are more interested in just this general approach to cases, there are a lot of other options on the market already. The Cougar Conquer, Zigmatex ripoff, Antex ripoff, and plenty of others where they have that kind of semi-open approach to design. The AHT-600 is cool for the right buyer, like the mechanic in our comments, but otherwise there are others that are similar to it. Switching gears to a more overlooked category, we'll talk micro ATX a bit before moving back to ATX and mesh-fronted designs. We made a comment in a video that micro ATX is a niche market, which oddly seems to offend someone on Reddit because they built 3 micro ATX systems for friends this year, which means that it's not a niche market, because 3 is a lot. In reality, micro ATX is actually a small market. That's why there are so few new micro ATX cases every year, and the numbers that we have from manufacturers show that ATX and mini ITX get most of the focus because they sell the most. That isn't an insult to micro ATX, it just means that it's less populous and that each new case is more interesting as a result, which is a good thing. Silverstone had a follow-up to the CS381 chassis that we used in our server build with Wendell, but in a slightly different style. The CS330 is a micro ATX case, but it has some expensive toolless drive bays in the front of the case. Our understanding is that the drive bays add about 30% to the total cost of the case, and that's because the higher quality mechanism and materials for it contribute significantly more to price than your standard drive cages. The goal of the CS330 is to be like a smaller scale, all-contained computer with room for a basic RAID 5 or similar configuration. It's not as extreme as the CS381, which supports up to 10 drives plus SSDs, but it more closely matches a traditional, smaller computer with a serious storage solution and a backplane for connection. The chassis has a flipped motherboard orientation with the I/O and cooler toward the bottom of the case and GPUs toward the top. Additional drive mounts are available behind the front intake fan, which is a massive 180mm air penetrator fan from Silverstone's high-performance series. Back when we did reviews of the larger fans, like the 180s, the 180 APs were among the best on the market. The case should cost around $130 or so, and is interesting for people who might want to build a system with a small NAS inside of it. Another micro ATX option at the show is Cooler Master's MB311L, which has merged the previous line of MATX designs with the NR600's ultra-fine mesh front panel. The case is most interesting for its price point, with a target of $60 MSRP, and is set to include 2 ARGB front fans with an easy expansion option for a rear exhaust fan. The benefit of such front panels is that they breathe well, but also mostly eliminate the need for a dust filter. The panel itself is fine enough mesh that dust can be wiped off the front, so a secondary layer is less necessary, lending itself better to airflow overall. Tooling is similar to the NR600, except there's a tempered glass sheet strapped to the side of it. It's not the cleanest execution of tempered glass, but at $60, it's still an impressive mix of features versus what we found a few years ago. ARGB, glass, and mesh hit all the trends for 2020, while supporting hopefully decent airflow. Lian Li's O11 Dynamic Mini also deserves a mention in the smaller cases section. This isn't primarily micro ATX, but it is a case that supports micro ATX. The O11 Mini is reconfigurable into Mini ITX, proper full ATX, or micro ATX, all done by using modules that can be inserted or removed in the backside of the case, alongside an internal motherboard tray extension for larger motherboards. Larger motherboard sizes will reduce the usable space for radiators and water cooling, so space on the top and bottom of the case will be taken away, obviously, as board size increases. This is one of the larger Mini ITX cases on the market, so it's not space efficient, and you could get much smaller elsewhere. As we said in our O11D Mini coverage, this is more about buying into the look and the build quality of the O11 series, but sacrificing space efficiency instead for greater modularity. Ultimately, modularity isn't particularly useful, since most people will only use the case for one build, or might only use it once every few years for a build. It's not like you're changing the layout regularly. Still, it's an interesting approach to design. The case has a small LCD in the front that can read an internal thermocouple that gives case ambient temperature, a somewhat gimmicky feature that is actually interesting but not particularly actionable, and it can also show the Der Bauer and Lian Li logos. For more coverage on this one, check our Lian Li video from the show, where we go into more detail on the case itself. The O11 Mini is supposed to be about 37 liters, making it large, and it's all steel except for an aluminum top piece. The Mini ITX config supports 3 280 radiators, while Micro ATX and ATX cut down that support, and Lian Li expects pricing to be $90 to $100 without any included fans, but more discussion on that in our initial coverage. Silverstone had another rendition of the SG14 at the show, and is almost entirely airflow focused for a small shuttle-style ITX box that we talked about towards the end of our coverage there, but we didn't work too much with this one as we've seen variants of the SG14 for a few years now, so we'll just wait until we see the final product. Standard ATX cases are next. This year showed a complete overhaul of standard front panel design to shift towards mesh, something we feel we've at least had some impact on since we've spent most of our careers complaining about case design. Phanteks is worth discussing first. We gave the company a few awards for its P400A airflow-oriented case last year, and the company has brought back that design approach. We thought the new P300A was the most interesting at the suite, as it's supposed to be roughly in the $60 price range, and it's still ATX ready. The case is similar in a lot of ways to the Cooler Master Micro ATX box, just ATX compatible and under the Phanteks banner. The ultrafine mesh on the front follows the P400A's leading competitive advantage, so depending on the final fan configuration, this may give us a case we can start recommending in the budget category once again. There haven't been many good cases at the $60 mark in the last 2 years, and if Phanteks can pull it together for launch this month, it may have an airflow targeted case that we can actually talk about other than the 270R in this price bracket. The P500A was also present, which is a hybrid of the P400A and the P600 series cases. The Phanteks P500A also takes a mesh-fronted approach, but applies it to a larger chassis that can support dual system installations by using an add-on kit for Mini ITX boards. If desired, the second system would install on the top of the case. The P500A should include 3 ARGB fans in its stock configuration, priced at $130, but it should also ship in a $100 version without any fans or the controller included. For anyone interested in the P400A, but needing more space for water cooling builds or just more space in general, the P500A is supposed to target that market. It's the same tooling as the P600, so the interior is familiar and EATX ready, and radiator support goes up to 420mm for larger builds, with availability on this one sometime in March. Not all the ATX mid-towers are promising though. We wrote a lot more for this section, but we're going to cut it down to be quicker. Inwin, normally focuses on higher end cases. They don't do well when they're under $100. The C200, the 215, and the 216 are among the worst ATX cases we saw at CES. It's not even just airflow. These cases have all the features of a 2010 Cooler Master box, including thick, cheap plastic all over the front and the top. They have a plastic top panel that's glossy and matte. It looks terrible. The front looks like a 1980s cartoon robot on one of them and is flat on the other. And we're just going to leave it here. But, spacing on the video card vertical mount was a few millimeters or less from the GPU, by the way. So, not good cases. If you want more coverage on these, you can check out our separate Inwin video. Silverstone's new Farah cases are trying to understand the market. There's a possibility that the company does either an acrylic front or a mesh front, and feedback from the viewers in initial coverage was more towards mesh. We won't go over all of the Farah cases, but the R1 looks like a proper Silverstone RL06 successor. If you remember the RL06 we recommended a few years ago, it was a sub $80 case with a lot of fans and it performed really well. The R1 has a similarly perforated front panel design, a mid-tower body, and a price point that's $60 without fans or $70 with 2 fans. The Farah cases aren't perfect. We don't like that the tempered glass isn't flush, and it doesn't quite live up to the fan-heavy approach of the RL06, but we'll see how it does in review. Be Quiet is next. The company refreshed its PureBase 500 with the PureBase 500DX, splitting the difference with a full mesh front and a solid front. It's taking some design cues from the Lian Li Lancool series with that Cylon look, and it's trying to balance against going full mesh. Our prediction is that the 500DX will underperform compared to how it looks, but should certainly be better than the original PureBase 500. The center is blocked, obviously, which is workable, but the outer edges of the large holes are blocked by about 1 inch of plastic around the outermost wall of the mesh, so it looks like more mesh than is really breathable by the fans, but it should still be a big uplift from the 500. It's supposed to have an extra top fan, and the USB 3 has been replaced with 3.1 Type-C, but otherwise the case is familiar. It should be in $100 in March, and we'll review it then. The Cooler Master TD500 is probably worth talking about briefly again. This is an existing chassis, but Cooler Master took Fractal's Meshify geometric fragmentation and has applied it to its own case. The company has laser etched in a cut in the tempered glass panel, which ends up making it look like an acrylic panel by accident. The case should be about $100. It should include 3 ARGB fans, and this is the only reason we're really talking about it, because that's really a pretty good deal overall, assuming the fans don't suck, and it's the included fans that make this one worth talking about, and we'll have a review of this as well. Probably one of the more objectively better cases on the list is Lian Li's revised Lancool 2 Mesh, which we were neutral toward the original Lancool 2, or maybe leaning critical in our review, depending on which section you were looking at. We've been talking with the company for the last month about some potential changes that would improve testing results, and the Lancool 2 Mesh has implemented most of those. One of the main changes was the ventilation design in the back and the top of the case, where Lian Li will move away from the vertical slits and back toward a honeycomb hexagonal design. Hexagons reduce surface area of the metal and increase surface area of the ventilation, which should improve thermals. The company also perforated the entire bottom of the split doors, and the top of the power supply shroud will have removable ducting so that separately installed fans have more chance of pulling air in. The case should include PWM fans rather than RGB fans, and they'll be simple black and white at 800 to 1500 RPM. Lian Li plans to add a few knobs to the case that weren't shown at the show, one of which will be a 4-tick slider for fan speeds that spans low, medium, high, and auto PWM settings. The company is currently considering a 3x120 stock setup, and it should be $90 retail. As a quick honorable mention from the same suite, you should check out the Lian Li 315 in our Lian Li coverage from the show. It's $80, it has a removable motherboard tray, and it looks pretty interesting. For the last few cases, we have just a few larger ATX ones to talk about. The Silverstone Alta F1 is a big enclosure that's not yet finished, but might be appealing to those who like the older Fortress series of cases. The Alta F1 is supposed to cost about $130 to $150, should be out before Computex, and it's got a rotated motherboard layout that aligns I/O toward the top, where it can be routed into a separate compartment, and uses yet another component, the compartment at the bottom of the case, for air access. Rather than elevating the case on feet, there's roughly a 2-inch gap on the bottom for breathability within a sort of a compartment for air. Silverstone's looking at compatibility with up to 3 180s or 200s on the bottom, with the top supporting 120 or 140 with extra holes for the tubes for radiators. Finally, the Phanteks Enthoo Pro 2 is built on the 719 tooling, but has added the new Phanteks Performance Fabric, which sounds like sportswear. The Enthoo Pro 2 can fit 2 systems or 2 power supplies natively, although we found it amusing that the new Intel Ghost Canyon NUC could also fit in the vertical PCIe slot, while theoretically still running 2 systems. Either way, the case should be $130 stock, but other than the fabric, it's familiar to the 719 internally. So that's going to be it for the roundup of cases from CES 2020. It's most of the cases. There were some bad ones that we cut out of this list. The InWin case, the butterfly one that looks more like a pine cone, as everyone said, is it's a bit much at 14 grand, but there's no point in talking about that anymore. Corsair's Orion doesn't really count because it's a concept that's more to show off LEDs on a 465X. So that's most of the good and bad cases. Thanks for watching. As always, you can subscribe for more or go watch our CES coverage if you want more on any of these individual cases in its own standalone video. Otherwise, store.gamersnexus.net or patreon.com/gamersnexus to help us out directly. We'll see you all next time.
I mean, people love cheese and shredded cheese, so.
I mean, what are you trying to say?
I'm saying it used to be a mango.
Oh, I love mangoes. Same here, sir.
Frickin' delicious. Plus, this used to be a Japanese mango.
Very exotic.
That's the name of the mango.
Yes, sir, it is.
And we're people love cheese and shredded cheese, so.
I mean, what are you trying to say?
I'm saying it's